instrument. Among the furrows of a plowed field, there appeared a crack in the earth, from which escaped an apparently harmless puff of smoke. Scientists proceeded to study the seismogram Geological Institute, whose central seismographic station at Tacubaya is the center of the seismological net of Mexico. Here, the most accurate instruments constantly record the slightest movements in the earth, as this horizontal V-Hertz seismograph is doing, with a pendulum weighing 17 tons. Somewhere in this earth there was a slight quake which was registered by the
may crack open even the most solid ground. That gaping crevice you're looking at used to be an Idaho farm. Earth movement turned it into a chasm 300 feet deep within a matter of weeks. Slightly east of here, on the night of August 17, 1959, in western Montana near the Madison River, an earthquake dislodged a mountainside, sending it plunging towards hundreds of vacationers sleeping in camps and trailers. A dark reminder of the terrible forces within the earth, waiting.
The earth trembles, cracks, and Mexico is wounded by yet another of its recurring earthquakes. And as always, little children suffer.
It's all right now. It's all right. Come on. All right. Okay.
Hollywood is heavily shaken, but the earthquake's power is centered in the city of Long Beach, 40 miles away.
The entire state of California was jolted out of bed at 4:30 in the morning by a violent tremor. Bakersfield bore the brunt of it, as you can see. But the earthquake California will never forget.
But phoenix-like from this seeming hopeless mass of twisted steel and piles of stone, from these broken streets and tottering ruins, there rose a greater city to become a monument to the courage and faith of the undaunted Americans of the West. Quakes and flames shake and burn. Disaster stalks the streets. Hundreds are killed. Thousands made home.
In 1906, stunned citizens of San Francisco gazed at their city reduced to ruins by 2 days of earthquake and fire. 452 were killed. The damage was $350 million. Everyone has heard of the San Francisco earthquake.
In 1906, stunned citizens of San Francisco gazed at their city reduced to ruins by 2 days of earthquake and fire. 452 were killed. The damage was $350 million. By 1910, a new San Francisco had arisen from the earthquake's ashes, and the automobile was coming into its own. For a little while, the dying age of the horse and the newly born age of the auto lived side by side.
Disasters took a heavy toll. Oil fires compounded a disastrous earthquake in Japan. Its worst since 1923. More than 50,000 homes were destroyed. Despite the extent of the earthquake, modern rescue methods helped keep the death toll under 100 persons, though thousands were injured. The stricken people lost no time in beginning the task of rebuilding.
Nature runs wild in California, which suffers its second major earthquake in a month. The driver of this car escaped with his life when Bakersfield experienced 10 frightening seconds of tremors that hit like a bomb. Damage is heavy, and Bakersfield, which went through the ordeal without panic, now proceeds with reconstruction.
7 years later, Southern California's Imperial Valley was the victim. Even the roads were bent and twisted like strips of taffy. In 1952, almost... When you're caught in a quake, it's fine if you're brave, but it's best if you're lucky. You can't see an earthquake, but you can see the destruction it leaves behind. Here a quake cracked open a mountain range, hurled a town off a 1,000-foot cliff, left 6,000 dead. This happened to be Ecuador in 1949. But earthquakes strike anywhere, anytime, without warning. It could just as easily have happened to you or me.
Anchorage, the state's commercial center.
4th Avenue, the downtown business district. One side of the street slipped 30 feet into the ground. A $1 million department store, less than a year old. For many, what happened in those few minutes on Good Friday would live forever. In one blow, Alaska suffered the greatest natural catastrophe sustained by any state in our history. The disaster area contains 60% of the Alaskan population and produced 55% of the state's revenue. In a state with a broader-based economy, such a blow would have been awesome. For Alaska, it was calamitous.
Disaster struck in Greece, too. Earthquakes jarred the fabled Ionian Isles. For days, the earth shook. Buildings, then entire towns, toppled. Trapped in the ruins, hundreds perished and thousands were injured. U.S. Navy units assisted in the rescue and relief of the stunned islanders who buried their dead and faced the cruel task of reconstruction. Disaster left scars that will take a long time to heal.
The crew of a rescue plane looks down in horror on scenes of devastation in Ecuador as violent earth shocks continue. Frightened people run aimlessly about, others, numbed by terror, simply stand bewildered and helpless. 6,000 people perish, 25,000 are injured, 100,000 are homeless. In this ancient church, a priest was officiating at a children's mass, and now its granite walls are all but leveled. A grim search for injured is started as soon as nature's fury has abated, but it's difficult to evacuate hospital cases. Roads are blocked, rivers are swollen, all forces seem bent upon heaping an agony of suffering upon those already sorely afflicted. Practically the entire Western Hemisphere rallies to the help of Ecuador, many times shapen by quakes, but rarely suffering such ruin, horror, and grief.
Nature goes on a rampage and leaves destruction and havoc in its wake. Here in the heart of the earthquake zone, untold thousands of buildings topple in ruins as great crevices are split in the earth. Soldiers search for those who perished in Chile's tragic disaster. 20 cities are laid low as houses crumble like broken crackers. President Serda inspects the devastated area as with heavy hearts, the natives start to rebuild their stricken country.
Disasters took a heavy toll. Oil fires compounded a disastrous earthquake in Japan. Its worst since 1923. More than 50,000 homes were destroyed. Despite the extent of the earthquake, modern rescue methods helped keep the death toll under 100 persons, though thousands were injured. The stricken people lost no time in beginning the task of rebuilding.
Recent years hit the city of Fukui in 1948. The whole city was destroyed in 1/2 minute. Concrete bridges torn asunder. A hint of the force of the upheaval could be seen in these cracks ripped in the ground. The city's largest department store remained standing. Barely. A caricature of a building. More than 3,000 persons were killed in this disaster. There have been worse quakes. One in China in the 16th century wiped out 830,000 people. But nothing could have been worse than this to a mother carrying her dead child. It was Tokyo in 1923. A giant tinder box of rice paper and wood. Colorful, busy, alive. But shortly after these scenes were recorded, an earthquake virtually wiped out Japan's capital city. 143,000 persons died. 400,000 buildings were destroyed. In this century, Japan has been the victim of countless giant earth tremors. One of the worst in recent years hit the city of Fukui in 1948. The whole city was destroyed in 1/2 minute. Concrete bridges torn asunder.
earthquakes rocked the Greek islands of Zante, Cephalonia, and Ithaca in the Ionian Sea. For 5 days they continue as terrified inhabitants flee to the mountains. Almost 1,000 persons died when these buildings crumbled, and 130,000 are homeless in the worst quakes in modern Greek history. More than 100 tremors shook the ancient islands where once the legendary Ulysses reigned. The shattered islands lie along a line reaching from west of the Iberian Peninsula to Asia Minor, the earthquake belt. Aid is rushed to the homeless victims, the helpless and dazed survivors of the tragedy, and modern machinery starts cleaning up the rubble strewn by nature. Near Argostolion, capital of the island of Cephalonia, the American cruiser Salem drops anchor and unloads relief supplies. To bring food, medicines, clothes to the stricken population, servicemen of many nations join in an international mercy operation. Planes fly desperately needed blood and plasma over the scars left by this great upheaval in the earth. Nature has taken its toll. Now men must pick up and rebuild.
One of the world's greatest disasters, a city torn and burned by nature's most ugly attack, over which man has no control.
Typhoon Emma lashes Japan with torrential rains and 100-mile-an-hour winds. On Okinawa, planes on an airfield are torn by the big blow. The downpour turns streets into canals. Damage climbs into the tens of millions of dollars as the stricken cities try to carry on as usual. The frenzied sea smashes through a coastal wall that had withstood the pounding of waves for generations. Ships are helpless before the typhoon's fury. The sea has won this battle with man. After wind and flood comes fire, adding new heartbreak to the suffering spread by Typhoon Emma.
The densely populated northeastern states were dealt one of the most staggering blows in their long history. Within a few weeks of each other, Hurricane Carol and later a 9-inch deluge combined to reduce some of the nation's oldest cities to a shambles. 400 perished during these disasters, and property losses ran into the hundreds of millions. One of the cradles of American civilization was battered but not beaten. President Eisenhower, at the height of the disaster, made a personal survey of the stricken area and ordered immediate federal aid. Even as these pictures were made, rebuilding had started.
Blessings are subject to the furies of its elements. Man's work is puny before the onslaught of mighty forces. Lush lands are devastated by the hot breath of catastrophe.
1947. This freak accident took place during the spring thaws in Warsaw, Poland. Ice-choked rivers threatened to flood the countryside. As the ice began to break up in huge chunks, they attacked the foundations of this wooden bridge. And as the horrified onlookers watched, the bridge splintered like so much matchwood. Watch that automobile, trapped on the bridge, go streaking down into the water. Death and destruction in full view of a motion picture camera. Now,
alphabetical season as Audrey roared down on the Louisiana coast, making a shambles of towns in its path. 300 died, and property damage ran into millions. Thousands were forced from their homes. Dead were scattered over a wide area, and it was days before the toll was known. Caught unaware, the population was completely at Audrey's mercy, and Audrey did her worst.
Mud and debris blanket the fog-shrouded city of Sierra Madre. The angry surge tumbles from nearby mountain slopes, left bare by recent forest fires. The swirling muddy streams roll on. Struggling to turn back the torrent, inhabitants quickly throw up sandbag barricades. But there is no stemming the mounting sea of mud. 2,500 residents of Sierra Madre, near Los Angeles, are forced to flee their homes. Tons upon tons of debris cover the countryside. Damage runs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The mud is 4 feet thick in some places. Homes are engulfed. The job of cleaning up will take months.
Torrential rains beat down on the hills of Southern California, and each drop spells disaster. Brush fires this summer stripped the mountainsides of vegetation, and there is nothing to hold the runoff of water. First, there's a trickle running down Country Club Drive in the residential canyon area of Los Angeles. A trickle that soon swells to a torrent as the water follows the road that was once the bed of a stream. In the wake of the water comes the mud, loosened from denuded hillsides. There is nothing to do but flee in the face of disaster. Tons of mud flow down into the area, triggered by a rainfall that totaled more than 1.5 inches in 36 hours. While most of the nation suffers drought conditions without precedent, in Los Angeles the story is too much rain too soon. The burned-out hills had been reseeded, but the growth had not progressed enough to prevent the flooding and slides. Most residents were able to flee to safety, but some were caught in their homes, and one woman was swept to her death. In Northern California, there have been record snowfalls. In the South, heavy rains. Nowhere else in the nation has there been enough precipitation. Never has Mother Nature been so unpredictable.
Then in September 1926, the hurricanes came, leaving 50,000 homeless. Promoters insisted the damage could be repaired, but the tropical wind had burst the bubble in...
Across the Pacific, Alaska was shaken by the greatest earthquake ever recorded on the North American continent. Great crevasses opened in the earth, literally swallowing homes. Property damage exceeded $500 million. Scientists estimated that the Alaskan earthquake was 35 times stronger than the famed San Francisco one of 1906. Pioneer Alaskans were undaunted by the catastrophe and quickly brought order from chaos.
In Anchorage, Alaska's largest city, buildings collapse. Streets and homes slip into the earth. Fires break out all over the stricken area. Oil tanks explode, sending flames shooting into the sky. The clock stopped at 5:36, and 15 minutes later there was silence. Alaska had just been struck by the worst earthquake of the 20th century. A natural force equal to 10 million atomic bombs of the size that struck Hiroshima. To the west, Kodiak, home of the king crab fleet.
It got dark, and suddenly, here comes this firstborn. And then the whole thing went, of course, right through that channel. And boats and houses and stuff were just sweeping down there. It looked to be about 50 miles an hour.
My boat kept getting hit by debris in the backwash. I didn't mind the little stuff, but then I got hit by the Standard Oil building. Lousy thing, she cracked my bow.
4 or 5 boats running in a bunch, and you'd see them just going out the channel for all they were worth, and a few minutes later, here they'd come back again.
Valdez. This was the pier where the Chino was moored.
Looked towards the dock, and all I could see down there was the ship up in the air, and then down, and then back up again.
Like a 3-story building up above the dock. And then she came down, and when she rolled back the other way, they saw her complete bottom.
Oh, I saw maybe a dozen people turn and break for the beach. And they hadn't the littlest chance. My eyes can't seem to get rid of it.
Turnagain, the suburb overlooking Cook Inlet on a high clay bluff. The quake crumpled it in a moment and sent many of the homes slithering down the cliff in a wild 1,200-foot ride. The morning after. The people can hardly believe their eyes. As soon as daylight broke, General Moore of the Army and other civilian and military leaders took off for extensive aerial surveys. There was a great need for information to coordinate rescue and recovery operations. On the morning of March 28th, Alaska looked like this. The Alaska Railroad, a vital link in the state's transportation network. The roads and bridges had been hit just as badly. Seward, key port and railroad center.
And then there was a monstrous roar, and I looked up, and miles of beaches had just caved in like an elevator had gone down. It was fantastic. I can't really describe it.
I saw this huge wave. It was water, lumber, and debris just coming down like it was just going to engulf me.
I could see Seward, just a mass of flames, and I just wondered at first if the world hadn't come to an end.
Now the work of clearing debris, restoration of public utilities, and repair of key transportation facilities was started. The long, arduous job of rebuilding had begun. The problems in Alaska were unusual. The earthquake had radically changed land formation. Harbor breakwaters and piers were left high and dry. Islands were lifted, and in places the sea bottom shifted as much as 10 feet. Some harbors had little water left in them. Before extensive rebuilding could begin, it was essential to find out where the earth was stable and where it was not. Geological surveys took samples of the soil and new soundings of harbors and shipping channels. It took time to drill and study the soil under the stricken communities, but it had to be done if the risk of future earthquake damage was to be reduced. The findings resulted in relocating the devastated town of Valdez to a new site. After extensive surveys and consultations with town officials, it was decided to move Valdez 4 miles west, above a bed of solid rock. With the help of the engineers and other federal agencies, the people of Valdez set about building a new community. The Chena would return again. For some, there could be no thought of returning. There was nothing left. The survivors of the quiet Chenega village took a last look around. The wave had struck suddenly, sweeping the houses out to sea. A few had been able to make it to high ground, but many had not been so lucky. there was little left, only the desolation of a once prosperous village. The survivors knew that they would not be able to live here again. The memories were too strong. With the assistance of the residents of Cordova and the Red Cross, they moved across the bay to a nearby village. Since they made their living by fishing and hunting, the Red Cross gave them new boats and guns. It was not the same as Chenega, but it was a new beginning and perhaps a way to forget the awful memories of Good Friday. In other communities, the work went ahead. Anchorage, Cordova, Kodiak, Seward. The reconstruction work was aimed at getting Alaska back to normal before the winter set in, forcing construction to halt. There was much to do, and time was short. The winter deadline speeded work on the highways, badly disrupted by the quake. The vital rail link between the port of Seward, Alaska's principal year-round connection with the sea, and the interior was a top priority. The Army Corps of Engineers had the job of rebuilding the terminal and rail connections. Throughout the summer and fall, a vast number of projects were rushed to completion. Alaska was getting back on its feet in a hurry. Dock and harbor facilities were restored. The fishing and canning industry was getting back on its feet. The trains were rolling. New buildings had risen, and schools were ready for the fall term. The Good Friday earthquake demonstrated once again that the United States is capable of acting swiftly in the face of disaster. The armed forces and other federal, state, and private agencies had risen to the immediate challenge of rescue and recovery work. Once this was accomplished, they began to plan and build for the future. Alaska today is looking forward to not merely a complete recovery, but the creation of a new economy and greater prosperity.
In late September, nature again rebelled. A West Indian hurricane, without warning, raked the Atlantic coastline. Hundreds of lives were lost. Homes, farms, land and sea transportation were demoralized and destroyed. The New England states were hardest hit. Thousands were rendered homeless by the fury of angry nature. $150 million hurricane. The East's worst tropical storm.
Waves are licked by 100-mile-an-hour gales as they smash the shore. In this season alone, this is the 9th of the typhoons that have struck from the skies to scar men's lives. The turbulent winds and torrential rain send floodwaters swirling far inland on Kyushu, southernmost of the 4 main Japanese islands. Fire comes at night, writing in its red glare a new log of heartbreak. Dawn brings a scene of complete and utter desolation, thousands homeless, and millions of dollars in damage in the wake of Typhoon number 9. Waves a destructive way across the Gulf states. Spawn in the Gulf of Mexico, the erratic storm swings first against the Louisiana shore. The counterclockwise pinwheel winds turn gentle tides into frenzied breakers. Strange, unpredictable, striking only in the late summer and fall, hurricanes suck up billions of gallons of water before storming onto land. Trees seemingly bow in awe, and men are helpless. There is no stopping the winds that sometimes reach 200 miles an hour. A wall of water rolls across the countryside, swollen by the deluge poured down by Hurricane Flossie. Small streams become raging torrents, rumbling over rich farmlands. Lake Pontchartrain, just north of New Orleans, is buried beneath the flood. Rescue workers brave the swift currents to search the area for survivors. The waters rise to waist height. A city lies paralyzed. Mailboxes become measuring sticks. Swerving eastward, Flossie brushes Alabama and vents a fury on the northeast Florida coast. The battered buildings and shattered ships, flung far up on the shore, testify to the awesome might of Hurricane Flossie. But there is beauty, too, in the wind-swept sand that looks like snow. A barren landscape stroked by nature's brush. A stark and lonely scene left behind as the hurricane winds race on across the countryside.
The Florida East Coast is lashed by a mighty hurricane, the worst in 17 years, with winds up to 150 miles an hour, wreaking havoc from Miami to Palm Beach. Losses are estimated to exceed $20 million. Material damage is serious, but loss of life is small with today's official charting of a hurricane's progress and ample warnings to all in its path.
Wild on Britain's Devon coast. The tiny resort village of Lynmouth, which the English call Honeymoon Town, is devastated by a flash flood, which leaves townspeople homeless and makes a shambles out of one of England's most picturesque tourist spots. Water still floods the streets as army and police rush to lend aid. Houses look as if they'd been blitzed. So powerful was the flood, which carried heavy boulders along with express train speed. Now tiny Lynmouth digs out from the worst disaster in its history.
Disaster grips the Pacific Northwest as the Columbia River, swollen by unprecedented rain, spreads destruction. Here's a miracle in the midst of ruin, but the greater miracle is that more lives are not lost as raging waters spread over farms and villages in both the United States and Canada. Thousands are homeless and flee for safety, with the damage running into the millions. Relief supplies are brought in by boat to the survivors, and for weeks throughout the Fraser Valley, the flood hides details of the tragedy. Far to the southeast along the Florida coast, nature unleashes another terrific hurricane, spreading destruction from Key West to Miami. Winds ranging up to 140 miles an hour savagely blast a broad path of property damage, estimated at $25 million.
Mother Nature unleashes the fury of Hurricane Agnes across 4 states: Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New York. 134 lives are lost, thousands are homeless, and damage runs into the millions.
Already the crew is worried. They've seen hurricanes building before, but nothing like this. Their instruments confirm the worst. Camille is big, powerful, and is now moving in the direction of the Gulf Coast. The hurricane is tracked toward the Mississippi-Louisiana coastline, and the warnings go out.
All residents of the low-lying areas are advised to evacuate by noon today.
Most people take heed. Over 150,000 pack up and get out. Some don't. They've been through hurricanes before, they say. It's part of the accepted price for living in paradise. The forces of nature become an irresistible challenge, a break in the routine, a new thrill. The surf has never been so up, and the view can't resist the temptation. They take to the water, oblivious to the mounting danger. For some, it will be their last swim. By now, weather forecasters know this is not to be just any hurricane. Camille is showing herself as a giant, moving to strike the coast with all her fury. With the winds rising, the water level reaches the high tide mark. eye of the hurricane still out to sea. Reports come in that her winds are reaching over 280 miles an hour, the highest ever recorded. Weathermen begin to worry about the kind of water the winds are pushing and just how far inland she will reach. By early evening, one thing is apparent. Camille isn't stopping, and the worst is yet to come. stretch of coast between Gulfport and Biloxi, called by some the Riviera of the South, is underwater. Now residents of inland states start to worry. Will they be next? People do what they can, laboring through the night, confident that the worst is over. But it isn't. By morning, Camille has finally spent her fury, but not before roaring north through Tennessee.
The worst floods in the Midwest's recorded history tear a path of devastation through Kansas and Missouri. Almost 1 million acres of land are inundated by the rising waters of the Kaw, the Blue, and the Missouri rivers, and 750,000 persons are made either homeless or displaced by the swirling currents. It is estimated that property damage will reach $1 billion or more. Hardest hit is Kansas City, Missouri, with virtually its entire industrial section underwater in one of the nation's cruelest blows of modern times.
In its history, but a miracle of levee building saves these hothouses well below the river's record crest. The city of Renmark, too, has been saved by hastily built sandbag dikes, becoming an island in a muddy sea. Sandbags are stockpiled in the city to be rushed to danger points at a moment's notice. Thousands of families must be evacuated. Many homes are almost completely submerged. A cat, caught up in the swirling tide, struggles desperately for survival. Perched precariously on a post, the frightened animal makes a leap for life and misses, only to be rescued seconds later by our cameraman as the flood sweeps on.
There are some places where the poles and crossarms have been totally obliterated. There just aren't any. They're gone. We've got one 46 kV line that's got 14 poles down, and these are 65 to 70 foot poles.
Mother Nature unleashes the fury of Hurricane Agnes across 4 states: Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New York. 134 lives are lost. Thousands are homeless. and damage runs into the millions.
But nature's blessings are subject to the furies of its elements. Man's work is puny before the onslaught of mighty forces. Lush lands are devastated by the hot breath of catastrophe.
Engineers is attempting to halt riverbank cave-ins and erosion. Each shore must be graded before the concrete mattresses can be put down. The massive equipment contrasts sharply with the meager tools of India's flood fighters. At Vicksburg, a traveling mat boat spreads the bulky mattress made up of thousands of sections. Starting high on the bank, the prefabricated concrete cover stretches down into the deepest part of the river. Into the night, the engineers lay the mats, sometimes to a depth of 100 feet beneath the surface. Stretching mile after mile, a concrete shield to guard against floods on the mighty Mississippi.
Now, the danger zone of a flood. And to those of you who have never faced the raging torrent of savage flood waters like this, I can only say, you don't know how lucky you really are. In certain areas, floods are an annual tragedy, as certain as death and taxes. The only questions are, when and how bad is it going to be this time? There's no compromising with a wall of water traveling along at such speed. To anyone in its path, it means just one thing. Pack what you can and get out. When an otherwise peaceful river goes out of control, it unleashes a destructive power capable of wiping out whole cities. Sometimes there's no warning. A sudden cloudburst can create a river where none had existed, and heaven help anyone or anything in its way. More often, however, we have some warning. A steady, protracted rainfall will swell rivers to overflowing. Or a beautiful winter wonderland like this can suddenly become a terrifying threat to life and property. As spring thaws start the solid waters to flowing once again, the melting ice and snow bring the water level rapidly to a point where it has to overflow its bed. And then comes disaster. Even with warning, a major flood inevitably takes its toll of lives, not to mention the millions of dollars worth of property damage left in its wake. For the aged and for the very young, the danger is all too apparent. Somebody has to come to their rescue. And if you've never stepped off your front porch into a rowboat, you've got a new sensation coming. It's awfully hard to leave your home to the mercy of millions of gallons of water like this. But unfortunately, you don't have much choice. Of course, every flood finds victims who decide to stay behind, trusting to luck they'll be safe a while longer, only to find out too late that their last chance of rescue has passed. Man does make an effort to stem the tide. He builds levees and piles sandbags, but he can only build those barriers so high. And once the waters surge forward, man's attempt to halt the flow are pretty futile. Then absolutely nothing can be done but move to higher land and wait for the waters to recede. All living things in a flood area are affected. Human beings must take priority. So, all too often, bewildered household pets must be left behind. It's impossible to explain to this shivering dog why he was left stranded on a rooftop floating down the river. The catastrophe of a flood involves more than just the menace of the rampaging waters. Frequently, the threat of epidemic faces the homeless refugees.
There are some places where the poles and cross arms have been totally obliterated. There just aren't any. They're gone. We've got one 46 kV line that it's got 14 poles down, and these are 65 to 70 foot poles.
A momentous year of news. In early spring, the great forces of nature brought havoc to Southern California. An unprecedented rainfall and record floods inundated an area of 3 million population, taking a toll of more than 100 lives and a property damage of 25 million.